What's he building in there? What's he building in there? We have a right to know.
All right, welcome everyone to episode 32 of Reframing the Narrative. And this week we are super excited to have our guest, James Roguski, with us, who has done a lot of work trying to push back against the PrEP Act and many other health tyranny type of activities by our government. And just want to introduce him first. And James, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about what you've been doing around the PrEP Act and what's been happening with that lately.
Well, for many, many months now, I've been putting out the information that people need to be aware that the PrEP Act even exists. And so, job number one across the board is always education, awareness, clarity on what is going on. So, I will pull a number out of the clear blue sky, but I think I've got some data to back it up. I'm going to say at this point, 99.99999% of Americans have no idea what the PrEP Act is, and an even higher percentage have not read it, okay? And so that's step number one. If you don't know there's an issue, you want to try to get people to be aware of it. So I've tried my best to take what actually, in this particular case, compared to some of the other things I've been doing, this isn't really a particularly difficult topic to comprehend. I think anybody can and should actually read the PrEP Act. And when you get a couple of the highlights, if you're like me, who several years ago, when I don't remember exactly when it was that I read it the first time, my jaw hit the floor. I was like, I can't believe that I'm reading what I'm reading. And to cut through it and, give everybody the takeaway, elevator pitch, 30-second summary right at the beginning, the first line in the PrEP Act tells you all that it's about. It gives protection from lawsuit and liability to what I call the pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex, everything from pharmaceutical manufacturers down to a pharmacy tech who's jabbing somebody in the drive-through service window. You can't sue them if what they do harms someone. And that's just wrong on every level. And so we can certainly talk about, the many, many details, but since most people don't know that law has been in place for 20 years, once you know that it exists and you look at the last 5 years or so in particular, you may very well have one of these epiphany, eureka moments. You go, oh, that explains a lot. And what it really explains is that when the government says, as long as you do what we say, we have a law that says you can't be sued for any harm that is caused. If you were a hospital legal advisor or bean counter, accountant, and you're looking at the numbers and you're looking at all this, hey, if you do this, you can't be sued. So the financial equation changes. It's not about money. It doesn't, pay hospitals to do certain things. That's a different act. That's the CARES Act and other things. But it says, if you do these things, you can't be held financially accountable for the harm that you cause. That changes the dynamic of how medicine is practiced, and in a very, very horrible way.
Would you say that the PrEP Act is kind of a follow-up to the 1986 blanket indemnification of the vaccine manufacturers themselves?
In a certain way. It's actually a follow-up to a Biosecurities Act from, I believe, 2004. But it goes further, and in some ways, it's worse. They're both horrible, and there are pieces of legislation to repeal both of them, and I advocate that they both should be repealed. The Childhood Vaccine Injury Act is only about vaccines for children, obviously, right? the PrEP Act goes far beyond that. It's not just about vaccines. It's for anything that is done. Literally, if the Secretary of Health and Human Services says these products are named by him in a declaration, no clinical trials needed, no FDA approval needed, no emergency use authorization needed. Literally, if you dig down, a security countermeasure only requires that the secretary believes that these are beneficial, or they might be. It's covered. And so things like the ventilators, the I say fraudulent PCR swabs, drugs like remdesivir, all of the hospital protocols, whatever they did, and anything that is done to treat the adverse events from the treatment. So it goes down like infinitely a whole level. It's covered. And it's not just COVID. There are actually currently 9 other ailments in addition to, 8 more, including COVID, 9 total, that are covered. And the secretary can name any ailment he wants and any products to be used for that ailment. Maybe one example, if somebody went to the Caribbean and got bit by a mosquito and came back and they said, oh, you've got Zika, or, however they may diagnose that, any treatments that are done, if the treatments cause harm, you can't sue the hospital for that harm if it's under this covered protection. And so it's related in the sense that it gives liability protection. And so if you think about liability insurance, okay, a lot of, you can think of all kinds of industries where people go out of business because they can't obtain liability insurance. The government stepped into this situation and is behaving like a liability insurance company, saying, if you're harmed by these people, like everybody in the hospital, medical complex, pharmaceutical manufacturers, all the way down to somebody sticking a needle or handing over a drug or whatever, you can't sue them by law. And the government set up what they call the CICP, the Countermeasure Injury Compensation Program, supposedly a fund to pay out any claims, as an insurance company would put on reserve. But they just do what most insurance companies do, is that when it comes time to file a claim, oh, sorry, we reject your claim. And throughout all of COVID, only 39 claims have received payment of like a couple of $1,000s a piece. There's a couple of really big payouts, but the normal payout is just a few $1,000s. And when you look at the harm that was caused, you're like, you don't get to take away my rights, Americans' rights to a trial by jury and due process. And the PrEP Act even preempts all state law. I mean, anybody who is a constitutionally minded advocate looks at that and says, wait a minute, that's just clearly in violation of the 9th and 10th Amendments. You can't question any declaration made by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And this is the one that got me initially. There's a section in there that says, no court will have subject matter jurisdiction over the declarations made by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And you just go, wait a minute, we're supposed to have 3 branches of government, but Congress gave complete and total authority to an unelected executive, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and says you can't take him to court if you question what he's declared. It's like, did we just go from a representative democracy republic to a tyranny? It sure looks like it to me. And so the PrEP Act was snuck in an interesting way. We may have time to talk about that. And it's just been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. And once people read it, you're just like, this is insanely wrong. to protect people if they cause other people harm.
So I know that you've been really advocating for some type of repeal. I guess my question is, have you seen any traction or support from either side of the political aisle? And what does that look like? I mean, what has progress looked like over the years of the effort you've put in? Or do you feel like you've been stuck in neutral because politicians are largely funded by big pharma? I mean, what's that landscape been like for you, and what would you consider small wins?
You said a number of things in there that made me smile, and so I hope I'm going to be able to remember all the thoughts that went flying through my head as you were just asking a very simple question. There have been some wins, and the main one is job number one is Representative Massey, Thomas Massey, has submitted H.R. 4388 to repeal the PrEP Act. I mean, it's a very simple thing. The PrEP Act is a relatively self-contained law, and Donald Trump cannot repeal it. Secretary RFK Jr. cannot repeal it. It's an act of Congress. And so the only way to repeal an act of Congress is with another act of Congress. And so one of the first hurdles has been gotten over, and there is a piece of legislation to rally around. And that was like maybe 3 weeks or so ago that he put that out there. And Congress is on break. They're not in session right now. So what I'm working to do is get people to be aware that we can support H.R. 4388. If you go to repealtheprepact.com, you can read the legislation. It's really one page, and it's just, repeal what they did 20 years ago. The reason I was smiling is when they adopted the PrEP Act, they did so under very, let's just say, interesting circumstances. And so if you can rewind in your head all the way back to 9/11, then fast forward just a little bit to the anthrax attacks that occurred, and then a little bit further, if you can remember Colin Powell holding up some kind of vial of biological warfare in front of the UN, weapons of mass destruction in the Iraqi war. If you fast forward to 2005 and Hurricane Katrina, when it devastated New Orleans, the Bush administration did a crappy job of dealing with that. And so there was legislation going through both the Senate and the House for financing the war effort with the military appropriations and Katrina relief. And a week before Christmas, they got together with a conference committee to iron out the differences between the two different pieces of legislation. They went to sleep after negotiating late at night, thinking they had an agreement. And when they woke up the next morning, there's this turd in the punch bowl. There's this 14-page PrEP Act added to the end of the legislation. And interestingly, a whole bunch of Democrats went on record. I'll name a few of them. Late Representative John Conyers from Michigan, the late Senator Edward Kennedy, gave a very impassioned speech opposing the PrEP Act. And even at the time, Senator Joe Biden and Senator Hillary Clinton are on record as saying, they actually got a congressional legal expert to put forth a document saying, this violates the Constitution in a whole bunch of different ways. So they're on record from before the PrEP Act saying, oh, this is horrible, it shouldn't be here, it's unconstitutional, make it go away. And then they all voted for it. Because how do you not vote for military appropriations during a war and Katrina relief after Katrina? And so a month and a half later, in February of 2006, Ted Kennedy put forth legislation to repeal the PrEP Act. And then in September, he did it again. And you look at it and you go, it's really very clear that this was never meant to apply to the entire population. It was originally designed, if we're sending our military personnel and maybe health-related personnel into harm's way in war or some kind of terrorist attack, the government should handle and be prepared to protect them, whether that's with an antidote or equipment or maybe a vaccine, and be responsible for any harm that those things cause. So the government set this up to protect a small number of personnel. But the wording got changed and shoved in, and it opened it up to essentially, nobody can sue anybody, and it wasn't meant really for the general population. You can't insure that kind of stuff, and so it privatized the profit. The companies now can manufacture a shoddy, harmful, dangerous product, can't be sued, but they'll make all the profit that the government gives them to buy the product. The government protects them from lawsuit, but has failed to actually compensate those who have been harmed because they're acting like a really crappy insurance company that just doesn't pay out claims for the harm, and they're denying the enormous adverse events and deaths that the products have caused. When you dig down deep into the PrEP Act, it violates so many aspects of the Constitution, so many rights that are supposedly protected by the Bill of Rights. The solution is to make it go away by repealing it.
It reminds me what you're saying, James, of military contractors. You mentioned that they use the term countermeasures, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it really smacks of a military type response or operation. And I know people that have worked in, very close to me, that worked in military weapons research and countermeasures and things like that. And if they're dropping bombs on so-called enemies, whoever the government declares as an enemy, of course, they're never responsible. They never have to pay the price for the lives lost, the damage to property and everything, because an enemy's been declared and it's in the national interest and it's national security or whatever the excuse. And it sounds very similar, except it's got the cloak of health, right? That whole veneer to it.
Oh, you're absolutely spot on. And if you dig down the rabbit hole through the PrEP Act to the places that it refers to other terminology, you're absolutely right on. It's essentially for, wartime. And with Operation Warp Speed and the government's response, it's very clear that that's how it was organized. And when you look at what they are currently spending, based on, a declaration made by the secretary, because he has determined, not because there's data and facts and clinical trials and all this sort of thing, the U.S. is currently spending about $3.5 billion per year purchasing something, whatever it may be, to go into the national stockpile, for national security, whether that is vaccines or antidotes or whatever it may be. Now, you're not allowed to ask and they're not allowed to tell because national security, right? That's the cop-out that, it's the excuse that fits every, possible issue. Can't really talk about that, national security. And the idea is that billions of dollars feed the beast of the pharmaceutical industry, even if people don't actually implement it and take the drugs or inject the vaccines or whatever it may be. They have found a way to be prepared, and all of the cronies that have businesses that can manufacture these products to put them on a warehouse shelf somewhere to stockpile them just in case. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. And as with any other, if you just think general retail, okay, products go out of date and you got to replenish them. So there's that. But if you actually take them off the shelf and use them and get the country to believe that you need more of them, then you're recycling that. You got a whole nother order. You don't want to be running your military operation with just-in-time inventory. You might come up short in a crisis. So get those contracts out. And they do this with the flu vaccine on purpose. The whole point of it was, even though these things don't work, we have to spend the money to keep the industry in place. Let's keep them all busy in case we need them to make something new. Right? You don't want to start from a cold, dead start. You want to have this industry always going, making something, even if it harms people and even if it isn't really needed, so that the industry is up and running if you need it on a moment's notice. And so it does so much harm. It's unbelievable. And so, my goal basically is just to get people to understand that the PrEP Act even exists and that it gives protection to a whole industry that, in my worldview, from what I have seen, does nothing but harm. And to protect them when they do harm, in any other industry, it's the threat of lawsuit and or the threat of your liability insurance premiums going through the roof, that you're out of business because you can't get insured. And if the PrEP Act is providing the analogy to that type of liability insurance, if you take that away, their bean counters and their lawyers are going to reevaluate the equation of the profitability of making all these toxic compounds. And they're going to go, no, we're not doing it. It's not worth it.
I totally understand the idea of wanting to repeal the PrEP Act because it is truly evil at its core. But just listening to your explanation there, I had this thought that is the maybe not better, but maybe equally parallel and as important, would the approach be also raising awareness about the harm that vaccines do and their unnecessary application in general? In other words, if you remove the demand, then I think the legislation follows, but I think there's still this large population that believes these things are necessary. And I wonder, if there's no demand, then a product can't be sold or pushed. And I wonder if that's just as equally as important, because I wonder too, in a perfect world, if this were repealed, would the average person have the resources to go after a big pharma company? What would that look like? I mean, your point's well taken about liability insurance, but, at the end of the day, some new fake pandemic could come along and they could declare a need and slip another piece of legislation in. And I wonder if, repealing one act is maybe cutting a limb off a tree versus, taking the root and having the whole thing tumble. What are your thoughts on that?
All very valid questions worthy of discussion, okay? But it's a little bit deeper in the sense that it's not just vaccines, okay? If you look at something like bird flu, right? One of the protected things is a drug called Tamiflu. Man, do your homework on Tamiflu. It's a horror story. It's an absolute horror story. But if it was a situation where that's what was recommended, Tamiflu back in, I think, 2018, there was an influenza outbreak, and it causes severe mental delusion in the sense of, people being suicidal and so forth. So it's not just the harms associated with vaccines. It's any hospital protocol, anything that's recommended. And the way it was implemented for COVID still astonishes me, because what happens with this, so people understand, the PrEP Act is the law that gives, kind of sort of arranges the authorities within government. It gives the secretary authority to make declarations. It takes away authority from the states. It takes away authority from the courts. It makes it so that people cannot sue, that they have to go through this really cockeyed, ridiculous claims program if they are injured, okay? But it says in there that the secretary is supposed to name the products that are protected or covered countermeasures. But the way that actually got implemented is there have been declarations under the PrEP Act for COVID, and then amendments to those declarations again and again and again. There's actually 12 amendments to the original 2020 declaration, and it literally says anything that anybody in the industry does, so long as you've got a diagnosis of COVID, you can't sue them. So your point is very well taken, taking away the demand for that, but they've got it covering everything. If you walked into the hospital and they got a diagnosis of COVID, whatever they did to you, can't sue them. And so, malpractice is out the window, and worse, many people who lost loved ones due to the hospital protocols. I mean, think back, it's a horror story, 4 or 5 years of, you weren't allowed to be a patient advocate. You couldn't be at their bedside. People said, no, I don't want this. No, I don't want that. And they got it anyways. They wanted other kinds of treatment, and those things were rejected. And they got the, midazolam and a ventilator or some other, harsh drug. If you think about it and you understand what those things did, they gave drugs to stop people's ability to breathe so they can shove a tube down their throat to have a mechanical device breathe for them. And their body's trying to get rid of all of this mucus, but it can't. I mean, that's pretty darn close to medical murder. That's just wrong, but it's covered because anything they did, the remdesivir, I call it run death is near because it shut down people's kidneys and then you've got fluid building up in the lung. That doesn't make any sense, especially even if you believe in, the virus idea. If it's given, a week in, it's an antiviral. That's not the phase of the ailment that you're in. That's just flat out murder. Okay, that's crazy. Other pieces of legislation incentivize that financially. And so your points are absolutely correct, but the PrEP Act covers way more. And so if someone is ill and they're in the hospital and they go, oh, you've got Zika or Marburg or Ebola or whatever they do to you, okay, they're off scot-free. If they make a mistake and they cause harm, sorry, take it up with the countermeasure injury compensation program, but they don't pay out any money. And, all the money in the world isn't going to get a loved one back, isn't going to get your health back. So I would say this is maybe not the taproot of the problem, but it is one of the roots of the problem. And the way I see it is the age-old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. The process that we have to recognize is that laws have been put in place that make unethical, immoral activity technically legal. And the only path is to repeal those laws. So if taking this little nibble out of this massive amount of horrible legislation, which they keep adding more, right? They just added liability protection for not insecticides, herbicides and pesticides and all that sort of thing. They don't have to label it. You just make whatever toxin you want and spread it around wherever you want. And if people don't know any better, you can't be sued. That's just wrong. It's just wrong on every single level. But this is what our legislative, groups are doing.
Yeah, unfortunately, one of my, I guess you'd call it favorite examples of someone being killed by the death protocols of 2020 is the late, great Rob Skiba. He was forced into that protocol, and then once he died, the press had a field day with it, calling him anti-vaxxer, flat earther, making fun of him, and basically dancing on his grave. And there's a lot of lower profile situations where people were forced into the same protocol and had the same outcome. So I do agree with you fundamentally that is a big bite out of the elephant that should be pursued. But and I'm not saying there's one right way. I think there's many bites to be taken, and certainly raising the awareness of the fraud of virology and, vaccines in general, I think is another big part of the equation. Jacob, you've been sitting there very silently and patiently. What other thoughts do you have to add to this conversation?
Well, just a comment first and then a question. I noticed that James, in two of your recent articles on Substack, for the benefit of our listeners, James is a prolific Substacker with quite a following and really lively commentary on all his articles, and it's a great place to be if you're not there already. So a little plug for that. If James was too modest to plug himself, I did it for him. So two of the articles, one is basically we got to repeal the PrEP Act, and another is about the democide, which means death by government or murder by government. And then your most recent one, dated August 5th, you mentioned that basically a government body called BARDA, that most people, if they haven't heard of the PrEP Act, I guarantee they certainly haven't heard of BARDA. It's to me, it seems like it's the kind of the girding, the codification of the PrEP Act in terms of like the organization that allowed this unilateral declaration of any kind of, whether it's a situation or emergency, and you can just define it however. I think that the crux of what we're talking about is that government can unilaterally just declare something and define something, an issue, and therefore justify the so-called countermeasures that they give themselves. So if we don't believe there are viruses, if we don't believe that Zika is a problem or that it's something else, it's actually comes from pesticides or something like that, the government defines it as a virus, therefore there are certain countermeasures. So we're dealing with a superstructure, a legal superstructure, and a policy superstructure that can just run roughshod over science and those subject to that government under it. So I am a little curious, how does BARDA relate? Because I understand that it was formed about a year after the PrEP Act was passed. How does that kind of play into things, if it does at all?
Well, I will give a plug for BARDA in the sense, if you go to medicalcountermeasures.gov, and you can go to /BARDA/CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear medical countermeasures, CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear medical countermeasures, medicalcountermeasures.gov. If you want to get involved in the horror story, they are the ones who are claiming, well, we've got to be prepared. There's a world out there that is trying to kill us. And so, let us kill you first, okay? We're going to provide you with all of these medical countermeasures that are going to save you from the problem. And so I'm an open-minded person, and I'm willing to have a discussion or a debate, with anybody about, what is the best way forward. But there's this two-faced, they would call it dual-use research, where, are you protecting us from problems, or are you actually making those problems worse with the treatments that you're recommending to the problems that you're imagining? Okay. Now, that's an oversimplification, and it might, detract from the simplicity of repealing the PrEP Act. But BARDA, is the science from the point of view of the government. And not that I really want to talk about this, but, recently, past couple of days, Robert F. Kennedy put out a statement, official government statement. And if you cut through all of the chatter around the edges, he said that the jabs did not work. He said, and I would say, and doctors like Dr. Sukrit Bhakti would say, all you had to do was look at the design of what they were talking about, and they could not ever possibly have worked based on, what they were trying to do with the technology. It could not ever have possibly prevented COVID, okay? We've known for years that it didn't prevent COVID, didn't prevent transmission of COVID. Well, he finally said it, Okay. Then he said, well, very sweet words, quite frankly, well, the risks outweigh the benefits. That's code for we killed more people than we saved. We harmed more people than we helped. Okay. You would have been better off to not do it. But they didn't take the products off the market. That's the definition of democide. Your government knows that the products don't work, they're not effective. Your government knows that they cause harm, they're not safe. Still providing the product. What do you want to call that? I call it, legalized democide. But it gets worse because, there's a whole bunch of research, $500 million, that they're taking that money out of whatever they were researching. Okay, is any of that money going to go to help the people that you're not, addressing the claims that they made about the harms that you caused with the things that you know are causing harm? Where's that money going? It's not going into mRNA research. Well, if you read the fine print, it is continuing to support work by Arcturus and I keep forgetting the name of the other company. They're doing research on self-amplifying RNA and a whole new thing that probably most people have not heard from a company called Amplitude, trans-amplifying RNA. And you just go, well, wait a minute, what did he actually say? We're not researching on this old RNA technology. That is so 2020, right? We're going into this untested novel platform that's even worse. And, do we have to go through another round of this type of thing with COVID where, we're in love with this new technology, it's going to save everybody, only to find out that it's even worse than the technology that they used during COVID. So anything that they say is, we think this might help. We don't have clinical trials. We don't have FDA approval, which is suspect out of the gate because half of the FDA's budget comes from the companies to speed up their approval process. Emergency use authorized, anybody ever over the last 5.5 years who said that any emergency use authorized product was safe and effective by law was lying, okay? But the PrEP Act says you can promote a product and you can't be sued. So it essentially said, yeah, lie all you want, we don't care, you're covered. Well, this is just wrong on so many levels that I honestly forget what the question was.
Well, let's forget the question because really my takeaway from your response to whatever question it was as long as this superstructure, this policy structure where issues can be defined unilaterally and declared problems, and then the countermeasures given and with absolutely zero accountability, then people like us who are like, we would never be liable to take one of those things or anything, but those that would take any kind of medical countermeasure, they're subject to basically a safer and more effective poison in a way, right? So whatever the new poison that comes along and is declared a solution to a made up or real problem, whichever the case may be, it just allows that to take the place of something that may be antiquated or replaced by, such as mRNA. Maybe there's a new and better, like a 38 caliber revolver used to be like the what do you call that, the carry weapon for the cops, and now they carry 45.
Well, you get a new
right?
lens for your camera, right?
Yeah.
You're shooting
It's
people.
just-
Oh wow,
yeah,
I got
so-
I can be further away and get a better shot. Exactly.
Yeah. So as long as the PrEP Act remains in place, I think the takeaway is that it doesn't really matter what medicine specifically is or whatever the vaccine or whatever we're dealing with. It's just always going to be the same thing. And they can always roll out something with a new campaign and just say, look, we've got a new problem, we've got a new solution, let's go for it. And they could do it, they could mobilize on the level of a COVID at any time.
And, I think what might happen in the future, I don't like to speculate, but there's an idea, and again, I'm not a military person by any stretch of the imagination, but there's an idea that we're always fighting the last war, okay? And so what I see coming is not one big problem. Oh, there's some outbreak in Borneo, there's an outbreak in Pakistan, there's an outbreak in Botswana, there's an outbreak in Ecuador, okay? If you're concerned about it, make sure you get your kids injected, okay? Or, as it is right now, be careful if you're elderly, you might get shingles, or you might get dementia, or you might get this, that, or the other thing. There's hundreds of trials currently ongoing. And if you really, I don't mean to fearmonger, I apologize in advance, okay? But if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look up, vaccine studies, there are hundreds of them. People in your community are participating in these trials. They are being injected with experimental stuff, and you're crossing paths with them in the grocery store or the hardware store or at the restaurant or wherever you may be, okay? And there's pretty decent evidence with some of the variants from COVID that they might have actually leaked out through shedding into the community, right? Now, there will be people who say, oh, I don't believe in viruses. I don't believe in that theory. Okay, fine. That's a very valid point. There is no evidence that these things cause these problems, but people are being used as guinea pigs with the technology that, I don't want to incriminate Vivek Ramaswamy, okay? But have you ever heard, because it's not related in any way, shape, or form, have you ever heard of Vivek vaccines? They're viral vector immunocontraceptives, VVIC. The idea is if you have an infestation of some kind of pest, rat, mice, whatever it might be, you inject a couple of them, they go back to the group and shed on the rest of the group, and it makes them sterile. It's a viral vector immunocontraceptive. Now, I'm not saying that that's what they're using. What I'm saying is it's clear that the technology can come out of the body of the person that was injected, whether it's by touch or aerosolized, affect people around them. This has got to stop. You guys are messing with things that the general public does not comprehend the danger of what they're doing. Now, the people doing it, they have to know the dangers, right? And they're doing it anyways. And it's in the documentation that, if you had personal contact and somebody shows symptoms, they're supposed to report it, which is prima facie evidence that they know that this is happening. Okay? Well, there's hundreds of trials. And, around the world, maybe even thousands. They're trying to come up with an mRNA gene-based solution to every problem under the sun. Maybe there's some amazing technology in there that you go, oh, well, you can't not study it because you might have the cure for cancer. Well, there's thousands of cures for cancer. You stop doing the things that cause it, but you can't make a lot of money off of that. So they're playing this moonshot game of, well, we have to do this high-tech studies because if we don't do it, China's going to do it, or Russia's going to do it, or some other, Iran or North Korea or whatever. It's a very military viewpoint of Russia or China or North Korea or Iran. They're going to nuke us, so we've got to have all the technology. We got to spend $1 trillion a year to defend ourselves. Just replace military-industrial complex with pharmaceutical hospital emergency industrial complex. Be afraid of these, boogeyman viruses. Give us money to do research and build out this industry. Give us more money, give us more money, give us more money. And the treatments are worse than the problem ever could have been. this is the world in which we live, and this is the world of BARDA and medicalcountermeasures.gov. This is where your tax dollars are going. How about we stick Doge on the pharmaceutical industry and all of the failures of the trillions of dollars? The medical establishment is 5 times the size of the military industrial complex. If you're looking at a $37 billion deficit, or I should say debt, national debt, that's all gone to big pharma over the 60 years since they put in Medicare and Medicaid. If you look at the taxes that were collected to fund the healthcare programs in the United States, and you look at the money that was given from the government to big pharma, you'll see how we've been robbed and, quite frankly, murdered by big pharma. They're more effective than the military industrial complex at blowing through money and killing people. And the PrEP Act is a teeny tiny little piece of that. It's like taking a little zit out of the belly of the beast here, but it's something that I think people can comprehend. If you read the PrEP Act, it's wrong on every single level, and it needs to go away.
There's so many questions that I still have, and I don't think we have time for today, but I think this has been really educational. And just as maybe a closing thought, James, what would you encourage our listeners to do? One thing that Jake and I have been really emphasizing in our recent podcasts is walking the talk and taking action, not just, talking about it online or what have you. So what would you recommend to our listeners to really help push back against the PrEP Act and some of the other medical tyranny that's out there? And maybe in concluding, you could also tell people where to find you.
It's all included into one. I've tried to make it easy. If people go to repealtheprepact.com, you'll find all the information. In every interview I've ever done, I try to remember to give people my phone number, which is 310-619-3055, 310-619-3055. I'm that serious. Just call me, text me, use WhatsApp or Telegram or Signal or whatever you want to do. Step number 1 is to learn, okay? Read the PrEP Act. I've written a summary. There's a video on top of Repeal the PrEP Act. There's a whole bunch of videos. This one will get added to the list. Share this video, raise the awareness of everyone around you. The process is always the same. Learn, get clear on the facts, ask questions, make sure you know what it is you're maybe going to oppose. Identify who your allies are. Share that with your friends. You could do it in a very simple way. And I suggest triggering curiosity rather than giving somebody a lecture. Just ask everybody you can possibly imagine, what's your opinion of the PrEP Act? Over 99% of people, if they're honest, will be, I don't know, never heard of it. What are you talking about? Okay? That's your opportunity to raise awareness and get people to learn. I have a petition that people can sign. If you go to repealtheprepact.org, you can sign the petition, regardless of where you live around the world. The point is not that petitions do anything. Petitions are bullshit. The purpose of this petition is to identify allies and organize according to state and congressional district. That's how we have to battle this, because everyone in their congressional district has to get their congressperson to sign on as a co-sponsor. And it would only take your representative about a minute to tell their staff member, hey, put my name on the list of co-sponsors to repeal the PrEP Act. If your representative can't take 1 minute to sign on, they need to go. And you need to let them know that you're going to work to make them go, and publicize the fact, how much money are they getting from big pharma so that they have that opinion, okay? And so there's an endless list of things people can do. I've put many of them together. There's a cornucopia of things to do on repealtheprepact.com. If you want to get in any deeper, just give me a call.
Well, we'll certainly put all those resources on the screen, and including your phone number, since you so graciously provided it to us. And also all the links that are relevant to taking those actions and we'll see where this domino falls. Maybe it'll be the first one in really opposing medical and other forms of tyranny. But you got to start somewhere. And as kind of a libertarian or maybe even anarchist type bent that we have on this podcast, it's really refreshing.
I'll join you there.
Well, but we live in the real world, and the real world has the codification of tyranny, as you've described very well and clearly during the course of this conversation. And so I think even those that have our sort of share our bent, we don't live in a bubble, we live in the real world, and we need to take action. So this is really instructive for us. And thank you so much for coming on and sharing all that with us today, James.
My thanks for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll second that. And I think at some point we're definitely going to need a part 2 because, like I said, I had probably half a dozen more questions to ask you. But
write them down when they're fresh in your mind and send them to me. In all seriousness, it'd be very, very helpful. Whatever is left, floating around in your head, please do. Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to a future conversation. And thanks for all that you've been doing to push back against the PrEP Act.
Thank you.
You just have to flood a country's public square with enough raw sewage. You just have to raise enough questions, spread enough dirt, plant enough conspiracy theorizing that citizens no longer know what to believe.